Here's what happened, guys. I had a conversation with a small business owner, and when I brought up capitalism, he told me that was greed. And that is a lie. Capitalism is a system that allows us as small business owners to own our small businesses, to be able to have this private property and to have the freedom that we do as individuals here compared to socialism or communism, where those roads lead to the abolish of private property. And it's important to understand this trap with socialism, where you can be sold the utopia idea when it comes to socialism, moving into then communism, that owners can, workers can own the means of production. But it goes back to who enforces that, and then what gets taken away for the freedoms from other individuals in order to make that happen. And we can look back at history as seeing examples of what the results are of communism, and it is evilness. And we need to continue to be reminded of that and make sure that as small business owners, we are uniting against these forces that are starting to seep into our country more and more over the decades, and that are starting to become louder and louder in our country. We got to push back against this. So, welcome back to the show. Happy Friday. I want to close out this week talking about socialism, capitalism, communism. It's important to understand these economic systems, and I want us to get ready for then next week. We're going to get more into this because capitalism is the greatest economic, when it comes to free market capitalism, it is the greatest economic system in the history of the world. And it's important to understand that for free market capitalism because there is crony capitalism. There can be abuse of any system out there. But with freedom comes a lot of responsibilities. And with socialism, and that leads into then communism, Marxism, what that represents is first with socialism is some of the confiscation of your private property, and then communism, where it's the confiscation of all your private property. And that includes your ability to own your small business. So it would be ridiculous and absurd for us to want to support a system where we are going to then have to give up our businesses. And when it comes to this utopia idea, we have to understand that there are lies that at least one particular lie I think of that I learned at a young age, which is that human beings are born good. And this is an important distinction here, where human beings are born predisposed to sin. And there's an important distinction there between good and predisposed to sin. Because why then do we have laws if we're all born good? It's an interesting question to ask. And if we're thought of that we can create this utopia, and that human beings aren't inherently selfish, then sure, this fantasy could potentially become a reality, but it's just not true. When it comes to socialism and communism, where that leads is to a monopoly of power. And then there becomes a lot of pain and death. And we can see that with examples in China with Mao Zedong, or in Soviet Russia with Stalin, and how tens of millions of people lost their lives through this system. And what we can't forget either is that most of human history, people have been living in poverty. And so when it comes to capitalism over the last 100 years, capitalism has lifted over a billion people out of poverty. And that goes back to free market capitalism, the free markets, being able to share your products and services based off of supply and demand. And when it comes to forcing someone to give that up, with the examples in history, and the saying is, oh, well, we just haven't found the right person to lead us forward into this utopia. Well, it just goes back to the multiple tries we've had when it comes to our world. Multiple times in history, our world has experienced people trying to implement socialism, and that moves into then communism. And every single time, it's created massive devastation in when it comes to those examples I mentioned of China and the Soviet Union. So with capitalism, we as small business owners here in the U.S. need to push back against these evil forces that are out there, and to remind ourselves that we have through this system, economic system, a beautiful gift in this country, which is the ability to go out there, have an idea for business, and then put in the paperwork and be able to start that business and to start being able to generate revenue in order to then be able eventually to sustain ourselves through our business and be able to support ourselves, our family, our community. That is a beautiful gift that can continue to help raise more and more people out of poverty. But when we look at our country and currently where we're at in our country, do we feel like we are moving more in the direction of socialism or more in preserving free market capitalism? It's an important question to ask yourselves. For me, I believe we're moving more and more towards socialism and then to communism. And the reason why I say that, it goes back to asking ourselves in the over 1,000 industries here in the US, how much involvement in your industry, how much of the government is involved in your industry? And asking yourself when it comes to regulations, to red tape, to even asking yourselves in your city, who's the biggest employer in your city? Because when we start to ask more questions where things don't make sense, be curious and ask questions, we start to notice that there's a lot of government involvement. And there can be, going back to protecting the customer, there can be an argument there for some government oversight, but do we have too much of it? I think about the big messes that we're dealing with in this country, where the U.S. our national debt is over $39 trillion. When it comes to younger generations, their livelihood and future have been intergenerationally stolen from them through this hidden tax called inflation. And one of the ways we can have more inflation is an increase in the money supply. And I actually want to share with you my screen here so you guys can see this. And this goes back to where we got a real backing government here. Because when you look at this graph here from the Federal Bank, Federal Reserve, you can see the money supply, how it's increased over the decades massively in recent decades, all the way up here to over $22 trillion. And when there's more supply of the money, then that can impact inflation. So when the other thing we got to think about too with communism is what does communists need to do in a country to break it down and to bring about communism? Well, there's three things to remember. One is private property. Two is then a connection with the divine. And three is then the family. And we got to ask ourselves, what's been going on in the past few decades here in this country? Do we feel like there's been an attack on the nuclear family? Yes. Has there been a decrease in when it comes to religious affiliation? For me, I was baptized Catholic, but then I felt like a tourist for most of my life when it came to my religion. And then just recently, I've come back into my faith. But I'm going to bring up this graph here, which shocked me to see this. I was like, what? At first, I was like, this is crazy. But to think back, all the way back in the 1970s, 90% of Americans were U.S. adult Americans consider themselves 90% consider themselves Christians. Now that's all the way down to then 63. This was roughly 2017. I can't even imagine what the numbers are now. But what gives me hope is there seems to be a surge now, in more young people going back to church. But you have that when it comes to the connection with the divine, and then the attack on private property goes back to how much does the government own when it comes to housing, to land. These are important questions to ask ourselves. To the means of production, how much when it comes to our different industries do we notice government involvement here, or when it comes to the federal government being the biggest buyer. That's something we can't forget about either. So all of this brings up more and more questions of, is it going to be better for our future if we have more government involvement or if we have less? Because again, who has to enforce this for the utopia future? Well, someone has to. And when we look back at history, it's the government that comes in and starts to confiscate the private property of its citizens. And when I look at different government organizations, there is a lot of inefficiencies that are out there. And I don't want this to be given up then to AI, and AI comes in and is the final decision maker. And we're giving that up to machines rather than human beings. But we also have to understand here is instead of expanding the power, is there a way to shrink that when it comes to the federal level? Even looking within the state and local, I think of something as simple as hospitality tax on a local level. Do you think if it's a 2%, your ability for a city to tax 2%, do you think a city is going to be taxing less than that? For being able to bring in, let's say, for an example, over $30 million. Do you think you want, just going back to how human beings are inherently selfish, a government entity is going to willingly just say, oh, instead of $30 million, we're going to go down to just $15 million because actually we can, that's enough money to be able to manage everything in this specific area for hospitality. No, the max. I think of an example, example of the 2%. It's like there's a lot of examples of going to the maximum for 2%, and we have to understand that that's natural for human tendency, but it's important we bring it back moral virtues for the future of this country as well. It's something we've gotten lost through the less and less people connecting, less and less Americans connecting to the divine and remembering that Christ is King. So when we can come back to our moral virtues and do what is right over what is easy and convenient, then we're able to preserve these freedoms that we have. And one of the freedoms is in this capitalistic system, the freedom to be able to own your small business. And I want to continue to have this conversation more and more about capitalism, socialism, communism, and the distinctions here moving forward. Because as small business owners, I believe, America's future leaders are small business owners. And it's important to be able to come together and unite on this and move forward and make small business a priority. Figure out ways to have less government involvement in our industries, and to make sure that we're not moving towards a future that is a communistic a future of communism for our country. I reject that. If you want to live as a socialist, you can in a capitalistic system. You can go live on a farm with your friends and go do that. But when it comes to being a capitalist in a socialist society, it's not possible. We get forced into having to comply. And that goes back to then removing the private, having our private property confiscated. And when it comes to the American dream of being able to work hard, put in the effort, and be able with less means go out there and be able to improve our quality of life and increase our means and be able to then purchase a home, that American dream, we got to continue to preserve that moving forward. And it's much harder today than it was. Back in early 1980s, the average home price was 3 times the median income. Today, it's 7 times the median income. And so we are continuing to go down this road towards more and more socialism and more communism tendencies here. And this is a pivotal moment in history where we have to continue to unite and step up and remind ourselves that we can move forward in the future and bring back moral virtues, bring back the family, bring back the connection to the divine, and bring back the freedoms that we have, being able to own our private property and to be able to own our small business. And with the 36 million small businesses the over 36 million small businesses that are out there, we absolutely can come together and have a big voice in shaping the future. And we just don't have to adapt to the future, but we could actually go out there and shape it. So if you're a small business owner who wants to connect with other small business owners that care about this country and the future of this country, then you can come join us in Charleston, South Carolina, January 14th to 15th, 2027 at A Future Fest. This is where you can register, afuturefest.com. We have small business owners coming already from across the country for this event, from places like Michigan and Virginia to those that are local in the Charleston area in South Carolina. I'm excited for this event. The plan is to have over 300 small business owners coming together, and it's been it's really important to be able to get outside of our immediate circle of influence and get really different perspectives on the challenges we're dealing with that can create new innovative ideas that we can bring back to our own industries and be able to continue to support this capitalistic system that is the greatest economic system in the history of the world. And we can't forget that. For all the benefits we have in this country, we cannot take that for granted for the wealth. Has there been a massive amounts of challenges that we're having to deal with and big messes? Yes. But we still have to be reminded that this is the greatest country in the world for when it comes to generosity, to the quality of life, ability to make something happen for a business and improve your quality of life through hard work and determination and to move continuously towards the American dream and achieving that. These are some beautiful gifts that we have to preserve, and we got to fight for what is beautiful, good, and true in this country. So excited for that event, and then I will see you guys next week.